Nora Colton is the acting Vice Chancellor at the University of East London. Universities themselves are having to consider their responses to the consultation and review the implications for them internally, but also will be reflecting on the wider market issues, partnerships and other issues that have been raised by Glenn. Nora, your take on the powers of the Office for Students and its implications.
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, I'd just like to agree with what Glenn said about, I don't think that this is so much a consultation, but it's a laying out of what it's going to look like. And so I think, for any institution reading through this is the new brave world going forward. And particularly if you look at how it lines up with the Higher Education, Research Act, there's probably not going to be much change that will come out of the consultation in terms of major change. There might be some tweaking. So I think that's, for me, something that we've all got to keep in mind. But I'd like to just start out with some real general comments before looking at some of this. And that's thinking about what those kind of priorities for the Office of Students is. And I think in many ways what we're seeing here with this legislation and now setting up the OFS is, this is changes that have been taking place. And often, I think legislation often, trails, doesn't lead. And I think that for most institutions, we have been evolving, we have been changing now for quite a while. We can see the marketization of the sector. I'm fascinated to see just myself in a very short period of time how the way institutions market, brand themselves, and how those roles and that sense of identity is increasing. But I think what I also find more fascinating, though, is how, so if we say structures lead culture, I don't see much structural change happening within institutions. And for me, I think that's probably one of the more worrisome things. If we look at Board of Governors and Boards of Trustees for institutions, where is the discussion about what the makeup of those boards should be going forward? What should be the role of university councils or academic boards? And so in many ways, I think that's where universities themselves need to start to give some real thought about what is the education character of the university going to be going forward? What is going to be the makeup of the governing board? How does that then fit into the executive? Because if we don't alter our structures alongside this, I think then we're trying to put a red round peg in a square hole. So I think that's something that the sector hasn't really, as far as I can tell, really started to grapple with. I think what I see the sector doing is, grabbing on to figure out how to sign up to the new organization and get on with that. But I think that's going to be more interesting over the next several years to watch how those governing boards will have to start to think about their makeup. I also think that the voice of students, how is that going to be authentic? If we're really talking about a regulatory board that is no longer the friend of the sector and is very much the champion of the students, then how does that become an authentic voice? How will, both in terms of the OFS, how will they bring that voice in, and how will institutions do that? Also reading through the consultation and what's out there, in addition to TEF as a metrics, there's a lot of focus on data. So there's words too that are very ambiguous within that. Then so we've got a lot of focus on a data-driven approach, and then there's a lot of talk about trust. If you're trusted, you then get a lighter touch. So I think again, how do we navigate there? Because there's going to be much more live extraction of data and information, much more data accountability, but where will we be able to really contextualize that? because I think in the current system with HEFKE, there is that sense that HEFKE is an advocate for the sector and has provided us with that contextualization of what we're doing. And it's interesting for me. There's a lot of talk about access, and of course, having your access and kind of progression plan, and I think there is that idea that bringing more people from disadvantaged backgrounds, but also a recognition that with the massification in higher education that's taken place here in the UK, that we already have a kind of bifurcated system within public institutions, so that you have what is termed kind of lower ranked institutions picking up more of those students. So again, how is that going to be redressed and balanced, in this new brave world? Because it doesn't come across very clear, other than these new plans that we'll have are very much like OFFA. So how will that actually address that? And what kind of accountability will be there? The other thing is, I think there is of course talk about free speech, and I think that's going to be something more and more important, not just in the context of we hear sometimes about prevent, but I think it's also where the sector's going, and if I may look across the pond again, I see in the United States universities, questions about voice is important. So is it in the context of academics? Is it in the context of students? And again, how will that be monitored or addressed in terms of public interest? Will it be for the governing boards to do that? So I think there's a lot in there, and I think more importantly is this question that comes back to what Glenn alluded to about this idea of competition, being a market regulator, and this idea that there will be an emphasis on innovation and competition. But I'm not sure when I read through all that and I see how it's a lot of regulation. So I'm not sure how that's going to drive that innovation. And I think what I see, and it gets back to what I just said a minute ago about small providers, is there's a risk here that institutions will play it safe, because actually in a risk-based approach where taking risks might put you higher up on the watch list, then I don't imagine that will drive a lot of innovation. So I think for me there's a number of contradictions. The other thing around high quality, I struggle to really see where that's defined, and that's going to be, yes, there'll be the designated kind of body, which will probably be the body we have, the quality assurance agency. So if you read through that part of the consultation, there's not a lot different than what's already there. So it's really understanding, I think, what some of these more nuanced terms will mean, and some of that I think we'll have to wait. But in terms of the concrete, I think it is this idea that there will be much more emphasis and accountability put on the institutions. Students will be given more information or have more access to acquire more information to help them make their decisions. But I think it is going to be very difficult, I think, in terms of thinking about how that will translate out. And one of the things in terms of just thinking about the consumerization aspect is this whole idea of the market competition. So one of the things even in the financial sustainability is the whole idea of looking at student numbers, and so again, how institutions will now compete, how important those numbers will be. Will we really see that kind of shift and to really big institutions? And I come back to the idea that I'm not convinced that those bigger institutions will drive that innovation that is so needed in the sector. So I think, as Glenn said, what you might end up is seeing, the kind of accreditation, credentialization of smaller providers, maybe companies coming in, different kinds of companies coming in, offering different kinds of degrees and certificates, and not necessarily in the way that we think about institutions. So I think there will be some changes, and I don't think they will happen rapidly, because those changes are already happening. The sector's already evolving, and so I think this is just really, for me, very much about a solidification of what has been going on in the sector. I think for public institutions, some of the questions around size, value for money, distinctiveness are going to be very important. And I think also, there are definitely research-intensive universities, but there are also a number of institutions that have research but are not research-intensive universities. And I think that there'll be many questions as to whether or not those institutions will move more towards teaching institutions with scholarship that underpins that teaching, rather than trying to pursue research. And I see this already happening in the sector, and it's not with new titles coming up for roles for academics, many more teaching-only roles that are evolving. And it's not just in modern universities, you see it in Russell groups as well. So I think that idea that teaching is going to play a much bigger role and be more valued, not only as a revenue source, but also in terms of the role that it plays in these institutions, I think is something that will really be accelerated through the Office of Students. And I think, with the emphasis on the TEF, and what that means, I think, the National Student Survey, and I think also the idea that, a number of institutions, are competing, particularly if we look at London. They put a lot of money into marketing, they put a lot of money in, but it's going to have to be very authentic now, because I think what institutions won't be able to do is sell students expectations and then get there and those expectations are not met, because then I think we run the risk of having more complaints, and then of course that feeds right into what the Office of Students will be looking for. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty, but there's a lot of certainty, because I think if we take the consultation documents as the way forward, I think it's very clear that we will have really progression, retention, making sure timely outcomes, employability will be very key. And it's interesting, because there's also alluding to kind of the idea that we don't want to lose the whole student in all this, and I think rather than my takeaway is that we run the risk here of not actually creating much more diversity. We might actually be commoditizing what that will look like, because those metrics will be driven through all institutions. So I think universities will have to really think very hard about how they're going to get that distinctiveness, and how they will make that distinctiveness authentic. Because again, if I come back to the whole consumer rights, I think it can't just be through branding and advertising, because they run the risk then of oversell. So I think for me that defining what high quality will mean, who will be trusted, who won't be trusted, that consumer protection and value for money are all the kind of key areas, but there's still a lot of ambiguousness about what that will really mean.